It's been a month. I know it's been a month, and also I failed. Hello everybody, I'm Roxy, this is recmebook&stuff, and today I bring you the History Challenge wrap-up a month after that readathon happened. So in case you have no idea what I'm talking about, because it's been a month, I'm going to link the History Challenge TBRM, or To Be Read Maybe, wherein I showed a bunch of options and then proceeded to read virtually none of them. And I'm also going to link the wrap-up of the hosts, so you can check those out in case you haven't yet. But basically it was a 2-week readathon urging you to pick up at least one history book. It had 16 different challenges. They were just meant to guide you, but you could also attempt to complete as many as you could by picking key books that would fulfill a lot of those challenges. As I said, if I were to count the books that I actually read fully within those 2 weeks, they would be 0. If I choose to highlight the one book that I finished within those, the only one I would have completed was the Historical Fiction Challenge with a book that wasn't even on my TBRM in the first place. And then the rest of the books I really read throughout the month. But because I do have a lot of books to wrap up in general, and because I wanted this video to be mildly interesting, I decided to lump all my history related books together. I'm sorry to the hosts. It was really fun. I enjoyed the live readings and the challenges. I will try to do better if you host this next year. Okay, so let's begin with the one that wasn't on my TBR but counted towards the challenge. Within those 2 weeks, I really did finish reading Possession by A.S. Byatt. This is a chunky book that it's a bit wrong to say that I've been reading for the past year. I started in November, got significantly into it, stopped for whatever reason, probably finals, picked it back up a couple months later, read another good chunk, and then finally I finished it for this readathon. I just had forgot this book existed when I did the TBR. This would have been on my TBRM had I remembered. What is this about? Very important. Basically, this is a half historical fiction book. It tells the tale of 2 scholars in present day. Well, was written in the 90s. So, you know, a while ago, but like modern times. 2 scholars, a man and a woman, and they studied 2 Victorian poets, and one of them, Roland, discovers a letter in a book that could signify that these 2 poets had a relationship, which kind of puts in perspective their work and their life in the way that new discovered data would do in reality for poets and historical figures. The 2 scholars meet and they embark on this adventure to discover the truth. It's kind of a parallel story. You get so much of the poets as well. I would say that more than 50% of this is set in the Victorian era, and you also get their poems, not all of them of course, but like a significant chunk. You get diary entries, not only of the poets, but like people they met. So it's just a journey of actual scholarship, although it's fictional, together with the journey of these 2 scholars turned detectives. And it asks really interesting questions about history in general and scholarship and literary scholarship, and like, why the F do we do it? Which hits so close to home. And the answers are not always hopeful, actually. It goes a lot into academia politics and how it's a popularity contest in so many different ways. In that sense, this could be considered a campus novel, even though it's not actually set mainly on a campus. It does deal with academia in general. The sheer craftsmanship of creating the different voices in there. So the people that write journals don't write all the same. The poems are very different depending on if it's an Ash poem or a Christabel poem. That's the name of the Victorian poet. It also asks questions, of course, about relationships and loyalty and love, because there is a romantic relationship at the center of this and what that meant and how we interpret those feelings through the literature. That, of course, wasn't as interesting to me. I will say this, I wasn't really invested in whether they were a couple or not. I personally was just invested in the research itself, but that's because of who I am and what I love. It's also very meta in the sense that it's asking questions about academia and why would someone spend so much time researching people who are dead. But at the same time, you are kind of following the same thing, but with fictional poets. So it's kind of hilarious because if you have time to read an 800 book about fictional Victorian poets, why are you choosing this over actual research about actual Victorian poets, if you see what I mean? It does get to be a bit dense. It is a lot in general, but I really enjoyed it. A lot of people hate it because it is navel gazing. It is. And so what? It doesn't promise to do anything else. What it does, it excels at. And if you like that sort of thing, you will love this. Otherwise, I don't think you should bother because it is very long, and I also don't think it's a life-changing book. I don't think it pretends to be. It is what I think about when I think about an escapist book. Just think it's a fun book. If you like this sort of thing, I would really recommend it. Now, history books that were on my TBR that I didn't finish at the time, but I did read an edition in Spanish of A Brief History of Drunkenness by Mark Forsyth. This was originally written in English and it was translated into Spanish by Constanza Gutiérrez. I really enjoyed this. This is a very slim but really informative book about what drunkenness has signified throughout history. But I think the strongest aspect of it is that it starts with a biological chapter, just one, to highlight why as humans we might like alcohol. There are evolutionary reasons behind that. And so it starts off the premise that there is something natural about it, but then it has been incorporated into our social system and how that has operated throughout history. I love that this is not as Eurocentric or Western-centric as you could expect. Of course, that is a big chunk of the book, and for example, it has a whole chapter on the prohibition alone, but it also has chapters on Aztecs, another on China and Egypt and Sumeria. I don't know if that's how you say it in English. I should have Googled this. You know that feeling when you don't know you have a gap in your knowledge until you speak and it's like, oh, shit. But in any case, it was highly enjoyable. I learned so much, and for such a short and humorous book, this is hilarious. It has like a very thick, relentless humor in the way that some British books do have, but I just loved it. I laughed out loud, quite honestly. I'm a dork, and this is the kind of humor that gets me. Having that in mind, the way that this factors in the social relevance of drinking and the spaces, so it talks about politics and class and even gender and how those are explored lightly in a way, but if you really think about it, in a quite deep way. For what, 200 pages? I was really impressed. So yeah, I think this is a really good book if you're looking for something light and funny but also really informative to read for Nonfiction November. I would highly recommend this one. Another great book is 21st Lessons for the 21st Century by Yuval Noah Harari. This is also translated into Spanish, and this is translated by Joandomènec Ros y Aragonès. I'm sorry for butchering that. I should have prepared more. I didn't. Damn. This can be read, I think, as a book of sociological essays that are history-based. So what the author does here, he takes key concepts that seem to be at a crossroads in this 21st century that's just starting, and he looks at how we've got to this place and then how we could possibly move in different directions. And of course he has his own opinion, right? But he also makes sure to address all the very real possibilities. This is so fascinating, even though for me it is a bit like preaching to the choir. It's great because the data is great, he writes so well, and each of these feel like a very cool lecture. I think what he does particularly well is draw from these very abstract concepts that we use a lot or that we think about a lot. So for example, nationalism, justice, religion, and then analyzes them into very concrete aspects. He doesn't really offer solutions, rather sketches paths. I think it would be a good required reading for like senior in high school or anyone at university. I think it's a really good resource. It makes you think a lot. But I will say that it was exhausting. It's not that it's hard to read. The language is really accessible. The examples are accessible. But for me, it was Like, my biggest existential dread and anxieties were a wound right here on my collarbone, and I had a finger like poking at them. And also the way that the prose just flows really mirrors my thought process, if that makes any sense. I'm an overthinker, in case you haven't noticed. And so it was very anxiety inducing. It made me really sad and angry. That is neither here nor there for the book. It's just, it is a very intense reading experience. I do think it's a really good book. He takes examples from many different places with many different cultures, and I really, really appreciated that. I'm gonna hold it up once again so you see it. 21st Lessons for the 21st Century. You really should read this. By the way, we will see how this ends up, but I've been talking for a long time. Another book on my TBR that I did get to was A Brief History of the Bodleian Library by Mary Clapinson. This is just what it says on the tin. I got it the last time I think I was in Oxford. You know I love the Bodleian Library. I love libraries in general. I love history. I love buildings. I love books. What's not to love? I thought this was alright. I did learn a lot. It's just, it's very dry. It's not boring, but it is dry. It's just like a history book, someone telling you. It doesn't have that narrative punch. And you know what? That's alright. It talks at the beginning about Bodleian's vision that this would be a library open to scholars from everywhere. And then at the end, again, talks about the storage and how now it is a very open, I don't know how true that is, but it is possible for people from a lot of places to access it, which is cool. But I think in between it got too caught up on the librarian versus faculty or inner librarian issues. So yeah, I think it was alright. That's what I'm saying. I learned it did what it's supposed to do. It just doesn't have any special spark. Also, I really love the pictures. Then I read Why Mahler, How One Man and 10 Symphonies Changed the World by Norman Lebrecht. This was on another TBR, I guess because I thought this was going to be more music analysis than history, but it turned out to be mostly history. That's why I thought I should include it here. I did enjoy this. It has some very strong points, but I will complain that I don't think it does what it says on the title. I know that titles aren't the end-all, be-all, and that often authors are not even responsible for the titles, but as a consumer, as a reader, I am influenced by the title, and I do go by it, especially in nonfiction. What I thought this would be is a look at Mahler's 10 symphonies. The 10th isn't finished, but it's been performed and it's mostly there, although unrevised, in a way that's much more similar to Catherine Kautsky's Debussy's Paris, which I read earlier this year and absolutely adored, which takes into consideration the history and the context and how it applies to the music. This did that to an extent, but it was much more a biography of Mahler with a bit of his music in it. On my August-September TBR, which was where I mentioned this, I'm going to link it down below, I mentioned that I thought Mahler was like a very musician's musician and that I hadn't really been aware of him before I started learning music. I still think he's a very musician's musician, although not all musicians, if this book is to be trusted. He received quite a lot of hate. But then again, which composer didn't? But apparently, in the US and the UK especially, there was like a huge Mahler revival like 20 years ago or so, and there were nights in London in particular where you could go listen to different symphonies on the same night. The more you know. So probably if you're watching this, you might have heard of him much more than I did. He's not very big here. This is just weird because it has so many elements, and I'm not saying you can't, mix them all together, but in this case it didn't come together. So it has the personal aspect of the author's relationship with Mahler. It has Mahler's biography and relationship in particular to his wife and some other musicians and his job as a conductor, the impact of his music on these days, and then some recordings recommendations, which actually I thought that was the strongest point. I think it goes, I don't want to say too much into the biography because I also don't think I know Mahler all that well after this. It's just weird now that I think about it. There was a point halfway through where I thought about DNFing it. I'm glad I didn't because the end part where Lebrecht talks about subsequent interpretations of the different symphonies and actually breaks them down and different recordings and the different nuances that they bring out, I thought that was the strongest part. I think clearly Lebrecht is really qualified, but also writes really well about what is going on right now and about interpretive choices, which I think maybe that's why the Maestro myth is also so strong. But I don't think he knows how to balance that with the biography. It goes on and on about Mahler's relationship with his wife Alma, but it doesn't feel very earned because also Lebrecht is very dismissive about how terrible Alma had it at time. It just feels very superficial, but it's also kind of a main aspect of the book, so I just didn't understand what was going on there. I think the strongest point, apart from the how different conductors and musicians have interpreted Mahler and have experienced Mahler, is the Jewish aspect. Lebrecht is Jewish, and so was Mahler, although he converted to Catholicism for practical reasons, really. And so Lebrecht analyzes the racial component in the politics of his jobs and how that culture seeps into his music, and also how it doesn't. So it's kind of like what Mahler chose to embrace and what he left out. I don't know. I feel very ambivalent towards this book. I want to keep it, especially for the last sections. I need more distance. Do you have those moments where if you think about certain parts of a book, it's like, oh my god, this is great, and then you think about the other parts, it's like, oh, this sucks. It makes it hard for you to make up your mind. Yeah. Finally, I want to tell you about Penguin Little Black Classic, My Dearest Father by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart and Leopold Mozart, because this is some correspondence between Mozart and his father. This wasn't on any of my TBRs. I just really wanted to read it. I'm very into letters at the moment. This focuses, of course, on their relationship as father and son. You see Leopold giving him advice, and Mozart, so interesting because he's young and he wants to live his life, but also he wants to please his dad so badly, and I think it's fascinating. They had a really interesting relationship. I need to delve deeper into that. If you are really interested in the letters, Penguin has a really nice edition of Mozart's letter, and there are a couple others as well. So I don't know how much it's worth to get just that, but I got this on the box set, so I'm really happy I finally got to it. It's number 51. I really enjoyed it. This should be translated, right? Yes, by Stuart Spencer. Really nice. I hope you enjoyed this video. It was a bit of a chatty one, or like there was a lot to say about this book. I enjoyed reading history a lot. I think you'll find that I mostly read history nonfiction by the broadest definition of history, of course. Video and the readathon, and I don't know what else to say. Please like and subscribe. Comment, have you read any of these books? Do you want to read any of them after hearing me talk about them? And did you participate in the history challenge? If you did, I'll try to check out your wrap-up. Please let me know if you have a wrap-up, but just tell me what you enjoyed the most or the least, and see you next time.